The first snow of the season fell on Colder Creek, Colorado, in the early weeks of October 1878, and it fell without mercy, burying the ruts in the main road and silencing the town in a way that felt less like beauty and more like a warning. Louise Walker stood at the single window of her newly leased clinic and watched the flakes come down in thick, determined curtains. She pressed one hand flat against the cold glass and felt the chill radiate up through her palm, into her wrist, and all the way to her chest. The wood-burning stove in the corner of the room had not been lit yet because there was nothing to light it with. She had arrived in Colder Creek 3 days ago with 2 trunks of medical supplies, a leather satchel of instruments she had spent 2 years carefully assembling, and roughly $12 to her name after paying her first month's lease to the landlord, a wiry man named Mr. Arden who had smiled too wide when she handed over the coins. She had no firewood. She had told herself it was a problem she would solve quickly. Surely the town had a supply merchant. Surely someone would point her in the right direction. But the supply merchant, a man named Hobbs, had looked at her over the counter with something between confusion and amusement, and told her that firewood was sold by the cord and the price was $3 a cord, and that 2 cords would get her through a mild winter, but that Colorado winters were not known for being mild, and that she ought to buy 4 at minimum. $12 did not stretch to $12 worth of firewood and also leave anything for food, lamp oil, bandages, and the dozen other things a clinic needed in its first weeks of operation. So she had smiled at Hobbs, thanked him, and walked back across the frozen mud of Main Street to her clinic, where she stood now watching snow collect on the windowsill and wondering if she had made the worst decision of her life coming here. She was 26 years old and a qualified healer, trained under Dr. Aldous Prentice in Denver for 3 years before he retired and sold his practice to a man who did not want a woman working alongside him. She had grown up in the care of her aunt in Kansas, the daughter of parents she barely remembered, and she had taught herself to be self-sufficient long before she understood what that phrase meant. She was not a woman who cried easily. But standing in that cold, empty clinic with the snow pressing against the window and the stove sitting cold and useless in the corner, she felt the sting behind her eyes and had to breathe slowly through her nose to push it back down. There was a knock at the clinic door. She blinked, straightened her spine, smoothed her dark wool skirt, and crossed the room to open it. The man standing on her front step was enormous. That was the first and most immediate impression, sheer size. He stood well over 6 feet, with shoulders so broad they seemed to block the gray light of the snowfall behind him, and he was wrapped in a heavy fur-lined coat that only emphasized the width of his chest and the power of his frame. His hair was dark brown and slightly long, curling just past the collar of his coat, touched at the temples with the faintest dusting of gray, despite the fact that he did not look much older than his early 30s. His jaw was strong and square beneath a short, neatly kept beard, and his eyes, when they met hers, were a very direct, very steady shade of green, the color of pine needles in deep forest. He was carrying under one arm a bundle of firewood as easily as another man might carry a newspaper. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was deep and unhurried, the kind of voice that came from a man who did not speak unless he had something to say. "Heard the new healer moved in. Thought I would check if you needed anything." Louise stared at him for just a moment. "I beg your pardon. Firewood," he said, nodding toward the bundle. "You have not lit your stove. Chimney's been cold since you arrived. I live on the ridge above town, and I can see this building from my place. Thought that was odd for this time of year." She opened her mouth and closed it again. It was such a plain, direct thing to say, delivered with so little fanfare that she was not quite sure how to receive it. "You can see my chimney from the ridge." "Yes, ma'am." "And you came down to bring me firewood." "Yes, ma'am." She stepped back from the door. "Well, please come in." He stepped inside, ducking slightly beneath the doorframe, and the room felt smaller with him in it. He set the bundle of wood down beside the stove without being asked, crouched easily on his heels despite his size, and began arranging the logs in the firebox with the efficient, practiced movements of a man who had built 10,000 fires and thought nothing remarkable about it. "I am Louise Walker," she said, watching him. "I am the new healer." "I know," he said, striking a match from the small tin box on the stove's side shelf. "I am Eli Bass. I live about 2 miles up the ridge. I come into town for supplies a few times a month." "Mr. Bass." "Just Eli is fine, ma'am." He touched the match to the tinder and the fire caught almost immediately, throwing warm orange light into the room. He adjusted the flue, closed the firebox door, and stood up, dusting his hands against his thighs. The warmth began to spread almost at once, and Louise felt the tension she had been carrying in her shoulders for 3 days begin, just slightly, to ease. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it more than the simple words could carry. He looked at her with those steady green eyes and gave a short nod. "You are going to need a lot more than this bundle to get through the winter, Dr. Walker." "It is just Louise," she said, because it seemed right to return the courtesy. "And I am aware. I am working on the problem." He studied her for a moment in the way that people who spend most of their time alone sometimes do, carefully, without the social habit of looking away. Then he said, "I can bring you wood. I have a stand of timber above my cabin that I've been working through for years, more than I need. I could not ask you to do that." "You did not ask. I offered." He picked up his coat from where he had draped it over the back of a chair and shrugged it on. "I will come back day after tomorrow with a proper load." Before she could think of a suitable argument, he had said good evening and stepped back out into the snow, pulling the door shut behind him, and she was left standing in her warming clinic holding the edge of the windowsill and watching his broad back move away up the street toward where his horse was tied at the far end of town. She stood there for a long moment. Then she went back to unpacking her medical supplies, and if she found herself thinking about green eyes and the unhurried ease of a man who built fires as naturally as breathing, she told herself it was merely because she was tired and grateful and had not spoken to anyone kind in several days. The next morning brought a break in the snow, and Louise used it to introduce herself properly to the town. Colder Creek was not a large place, perhaps 300 souls, give or take the ranchers and prospectors who drifted through and occasionally stayed. There was a general store, a blacksmith, a saloon called the Iron Bell, a small church, a bank with bars on the windows, and the clinic she had taken over from the previous healer, a man named Doc Garrett who had died of a heart complaint the previous spring and left the town without medical care for 7 months. The people of Colder Creek were, for the most part, cautious about her. Not unkind, but cautious. She was young, and she was a woman, and those two facts together made some of them hesitant. A rancher's wife named Clara Holt was among the first to come to the clinic, not as a patient but as an assessor, bringing a jar of blackberry preserves and sitting at the small table near the window and asking questions with the frank directness of a woman who had no patience for vague answers. "You trained under Prentice in Denver," Clara said. "I have heard of him. He is said to be good." "He was very good," Louise said. "He taught me a great deal in 3 years. You know about fever management, winter wounds, childbirth." "I have attended 32 births," Louise said. "I have managed typhoid fever in a settlement of 60 people without losing a patient. I know how to set bones, remove bullets, and identify the difference between a common lung complaint and the early stages of consumption. I also know my limits, which I think is as important as any of the rest of it." Clara studied her across the table and then nodded once in the decisive way of a woman who had made up her mind. "Good. My husband Thomas will be by later this week about his shoulder. He has been pretending it does not trouble him since July, and it is getting worse. I will see him whenever he comes. He will need to be told it is not weakness to see a doctor. I have had that conversation before." Clara smiled, and it changed her face entirely. "I think you will do just fine here, Louise Walker." After Clara left, Louise stood at her window and looked out at the street and felt the first real stirring of hope she had felt since arriving. The clinic was warming up nicely. The small fire Eli had started was still going, and she had added to it carefully through the day, making the wood last. But she was already doing the arithmetic in her head, and she knew that by tomorrow evening the bundle he had brought would be spent. She had gone that morning to speak to Mr. Hobbs again and had tried to negotiate a deferred payment arrangement for the wood, but Hobbs was not a man who operated on credit, and he had said so politely and without room for further discussion. She had $2.30 in her pocket, and she had spent the walk back to the clinic going through her options, none of which were entirely satisfactory. On the second morning after his first visit, exactly as he had said, Eli Bass came back. She heard him before she saw him, the sound of a heavy wagon and the steady beat of a draft horse on the frozen road. She came to the door and opened it and had to stop herself from laughing, because the wagon bed was stacked so high with split firewood that she genuinely could not see over it. Eli was up on the wagon seat, reins loose in his enormous hands, looking entirely unsurprised by himself. He climbed down, tied the horse, and looked at the side of the building. "You have a wood shelter on the east wall," he said. "I can stack it there. It will stay dry under the overhang." "Eli," she said, coming out onto the step despite the cold air, pulling her shawl tight. How much is this?" "3 cords, roughly," he said, already moving to the back of the wagon. "Maybe a little more. Should get you through to March without trouble. If February runs hard, I can bring more." "I cannot accept this," she said, though even as she said it she knew it was an argument she did not want to win. He paused with a log under each arm and turned to look at her. There was no impatience in his expression, only that same steady, unhurried directness. "You are the only healer in 40 miles of this town," he said. "Every person in Colder Creek has a reason to want you warm and healthy and able to work, including me." He turned back to the wood pile. "Consider it a community service if you need a reason that sits better with your pride." She stared at his back for a moment. Then she said, "It is not pride." "What is it then?" She thought about it honestly. "Habit," she said finally. "I have been solving my own problems for a long time." He glanced back at her over one massive shoulder, and something shifted in his expression, not pity, nothing like pity, but something quieter and more complicated. "I know a little something about that habit," he said. Then he turned back to the wood and began carrying it to the side wall with the patient, rhythmic efficiency of a man who worked with his body every day and found it no hardship. She stood on the step for another moment, watching him, and then she went inside and put a pot of coffee on the small iron stove in her kitchen nook, because it seemed the least she could do. He stacked wood for 2 hours. She checked on the progress twice and found each time that he was moving with the same unhurried, powerful ease, the muscles in his arms and back shifting under his coat as he worked, his breath steaming in the cold air, his face calm and focused. When he finally came to the back door and knocked, she opened it and handed him a tin mug of coffee and watched him wrap both hands around it. "Thank you," he said. "That is my line," she said. The corners of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was the beginning of something in that direction. He drank the coffee standing at her back step, looking out at the gray-white sky, and she stood in the doorway with her own mug, and they were quiet together in a way that felt oddly, entirely comfortable. "You came from Denver?" he asked. "Yes, spent 3 years there. Before that, Kansas." "What brought you to Colder Creek specifically?" She considered telling him the full story and then gave him the short version. "I needed a place that needed a healer. This town had been without one for 7 months. It seemed like a fit." He nodded slowly. "And you had no one in Denver keeping you there?" It was a direct question, and she appreciated direct questions. "No," she said, "no one." He said nothing to that, only drank his coffee. "What about you?" she asked. "How long have you been on the ridge?" 8 years, he said. "Came up from New Mexico after the territories got too crowded." "Too crowded," she said, with a slightly raised eyebrow, because a man who found New Mexico's territories too crowded was a man who had a particular relationship with solitude. He looked at her sideways, and she could see he understood the gentle irony in her tone. "I like open country," he said simply. "What do you do up there?" "Trap, mostly. Some hunting." I timber my own land and sell the surplus to the mill in Garve, one valley over, keep enough for myself. He handed her back the empty mug. I get by. You clearly do more than get by, she said, nodding at the enormous, neatly stacked pile of firewood on her east wall. This time there was an actual small smile. It lasted only a second and then was gone, but it had been there, and it did something interesting to the lines of his face. I should get back before dark, he said. The road up the ridge gets tricky after sunset. Of course, she said. Thank you, Eli, genuinely. He put on his hat, which he had held in his hand throughout the coffee, and settled it over his dark hair. If you need anything, I come through town Thursdays and Saturdays, he said. You can leave word with old Marcus at the general store and I will come by. I will keep that in mind. He nodded and walked back around to his wagon, and she listened to the horse and wheels move away down the road, and then she turned and looked at the small, warm clinic around her, the fire burning low and steady in the stove. The medical instruments laid out in their proper order on the side table, the shelves she had been stocking carefully all week, and she thought that perhaps Colder Creek was going to be all right after all. October moved into its second half with the determination of a season that meant business. The snow came in waves now, each one a little heavier than the last, and the temperatures at night dropped low enough that Louise kept the stove burning through the dark hours and was grateful every single morning for the wall of split wood on her east side. She thought about Eli Bass when she added logs to the fire, which was often, and she thought about him again when she woke in a warm clinic rather than a freezing one, and she told herself this was simple gratitude and nothing more complicated than that. The clinic began to fill with patients. Thomas Holt came in with his shoulder, just as Clara had said, and Louise spent 40 minutes with him before determining that what he had was a torn ligament that had been straining to compensate for an old, improperly healed break. And she wrapped it in a firm bandage and told him she would teach him 3 specific exercises, and that if he did them faithfully for 6 weeks, the pain would improve significantly. Thomas Holt was a large, weathered man who clearly found the clinic and its feminine proprietor somewhat uncomfortable, but he thanked her with genuine surprise and asked how much he owed her, and she told him 50 cents, and he paid it without argument. A miner named Cripple Pete came in with a wound on his hand that had been improperly cleaned and was beginning to show signs of infection. She cleaned it thoroughly, applied a poultice, and told him to come back in 2 days so she could check the progress. He came back in 2 days and the wound was improving, and he brought her half a side of smoked bacon in payment, which she accepted because she was not in a position to refuse food. A young woman named Jenny Marsh came in late on a Wednesday afternoon, moving carefully, holding herself in a way that Louise recognized immediately. Jenny was perhaps 19, with nervous eyes and a wedding ring that was too large for her finger and kept sliding around. She said she thought she might be with child. Louise examined her gently and confirmed it, and then she sat with Jenny at the small table and talked with her for a long time, not just about the medical aspects of the pregnancy, but about how Jenny was feeling and what her situation was, and whether she had people around her who would help. Jenny's husband was a decent man, she said, a carpenter named Ward Marsh, and she was glad but also frightened because she had seen 2 of her sisters lose children in the first months, and she was afraid of the same. You are healthy, Louise told her firmly, and I am going to be here for every step of this. You come to me anytime something worries you, no matter how small it seems. Jenny's eyes filled with tears and she gripped Louise's hand hard across the table. I was so afraid there would be no one here who knew what to do, she whispered. I know what to do, Louise said. I promise you that. On the Thursday of that week, she heard the familiar sound of Eli's horse outside, and she found herself moving to the window before she had consciously decided to. He came into town twice a week, as he had said, and he always stopped at the clinic, usually with some small thing, once a bundle of dried herbs that were good for poultices, once a length of clean muslin that she could use for bandages, once a block of rendered tallow for the lanterns. He never made a ceremony of these offerings, just set them on the clinic's front step and knocked if she was in. And if she was out, he left them with a note that was 2 or 3 words long in a firm, clear hand. Today he came inside because she invited him, and she had coffee ready before he reached the step, and he noticed this with that near smile of his, and sat down across from her at the small table, and they talked for nearly an hour. She learned more about him in pieces, over several of these visits. He had grown up in the mountains of Tennessee, the son of a trapper who had taught him every trail skill he possessed before dying of pneumonia when Eli was 17. He had come west because the East felt already too worn down by the time he was old enough to choose, and he had spent his early 20s moving through the territories, learning the land, working guide jobs for survey parties and prospecting expeditions before he found the ridge above Colder Creek and knew it for what it was, the place he was meant to stay. He had never married. He said this not as something he was proud of or ashamed of, just as a plain fact. In the same tone, he might have said he had never visited California. "Did you ever want to?" she asked, the 3rd or 4th time he came for coffee. He was quiet for a moment, turning his mug in his large hands. "I think I waited for something to want to happen," he said finally, "and I was patient enough that I never pushed it when it did not." She understood exactly what he meant because she had done something similar herself. "I spent 3 years learning medicine and 2 more applying it," she said, "and now I am here. I always thought there would be more time for the other things, and then I looked up and a fair number of years had gone by." He looked at her with those direct green eyes. "You do not seem like a woman who regrets much." "I am not, but I notice the shape of things sometimes." "Yes," he said simply, as if she had said something that resonated exactly. "I know what you mean." It was a small town, and small towns talked, and by the 2nd week of November, Louise was aware that people were noticing that Eli Bass came to the clinic on Thursday and Saturday mornings. Clara Holt mentioned it with a particularly neutral expression that was not neutral at all. Old Marcus at the general store mentioned it with barely concealed delight, because he was a man who had lived in this town for 20 years and found its social dynamics endlessly entertaining. Louise did not discourage the visits. She told herself this was because Eli was a reliable source of firewood and practical knowledge about the mountain country she was still learning to navigate, and there was real truth in that. He knew the terrain in ways that mattered to a healer. He had told her which families lived where in the surrounding country, which roads became impassable in heavy snow, which families had young children or elderly members who would need her services and could not always come to her. This was genuinely useful information. She was not manufacturing reasons to see him, but she also noticed, with the diagnostic precision she applied to everything, that the clinic felt different when he was in it. Quieter and warmer in some essential way that had nothing to do with the stove. That when he laughed, which was rare and therefore remarkable, it made something in her chest do a small, involuntary thing that she was not entirely sure what to do with. That she found herself thinking about the particular way he looked at her, like she was something he was trying to read carefully and getting something important from every page. In mid-November, the first real medical emergency of her tenure arrived without warning in the form of a rancher named Bill Guthrie, who was brought in on a makeshift stretcher by 2 of his ranch hands, having been thrown from his horse onto a fence post. He had 2 broken ribs and a deep gash along his left forearm that had gone down to the bone and was bleeding heavily. Louise worked on Guthrie for 3 hours straight, stitching the arm in layers, managing the bleeding, stabilizing the ribs with binding, and monitoring his vital signs with the focus of absolute concentration. She sent one of his hands to get Clara Holt, who had worked as a midwife and was the most competent person in town in a medical emergency, and Clara came and assisted her without being asked twice about anything, passing instruments and pressing cloths where Louise directed with calm efficiency. By the time Guthrie was stable and breathing comfortably on the clinic's 1 recovery cot, Louise was trembling slightly with exhaustion and the peculiar come-down that followed intense focused work. She washed her hands and forearms in the basin, dried them, and turned to find that someone had added wood to the stove, which was burning high and warm, and there was a fresh pot of coffee on the hot plate. She knew, before she even looked around, who had done it. Eli was sitting on the bench by the door, hat in his hands, watching her with an expression that was careful and complicated. "Old Marcus said there was a bad one," he said. "I was in town when they brought him in." "He will be all right," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. "He needs to stay quiet for at least a week, and those ribs will take 6 weeks to properly heal, but he will be all right." Clara Holt was pulling on her coat near the door and looked between Louise and Eli with that carefully neutral expression. "I will check back in the morning," she said, and she squeezed Louise's hand on her way out and gave Eli a very small, significant nod, which he returned without any particular acknowledgement. When Clara was gone, Louise poured herself coffee and sat down on the stool near the recovery cot so she could keep an eye on Guthrie's breathing. Eli did not leave. He sat on the bench and they were quiet together for a while, the fire crackling, Guthrie's breath even and slow in the cot. "You are very good at what you do," Eli said eventually. She looked at him. "You were watching, through the window from outside. I did not want to be in the way." He said it simply, without embarrassment, just as observation. "I have seen some rough doctoring in the territories. What I watched you do tonight was not that. I have had good training," she said. "Training explains skill," he said. "It does not explain that thing you have where you go absolutely still right at the moment when most people would panic. That is something different." She was quiet for a moment, genuinely surprised by the accuracy of what he had said. "My aunt used to say I had ice water in my veins," she said. She meant it critically. I eventually decided to take it as a compliment. "Your aunt sounds like she did not appreciate what she had in front of her." Something about the directness of that landed warmly, and she looked at him, this huge, quiet man sitting in her small clinic in the middle of the night, holding his hat in his hands, who had seen her clearly enough in a few weeks to say a thing like that. "Eli," she said. "Louise, thank you for being here." He held her gaze for a moment and then said quietly, "There is no other place I would have been." She slept that night in the chair by the recovery cot, waking every hour to check on Guthrie, and in the early gray light of morning she found that someone had spread a heavy blanket over her shoulders without waking her. She knew the blanket. She had seen it folded on the bench where Eli had been sitting. She held it around herself and listened to Guthrie breathing steadily in his cot, and looked at the fire that was still burning from fresh wood that had been quietly added during the night. He had stayed. He had stayed the whole night and tended the fire and covered her when she slept and left before she fully woke, and he had done all of it without asking for notice or credit. She pressed her face briefly into the blanket, which smelled of wood smoke and cold mountain air, and something else she could not name but that she recognized now as distinctly, specifically his, and she breathed in slowly and thought, oh, this is what this is." The weeks that followed were full. November pushed toward December, and the snow came in earnest, building up against the sides of buildings, and turning the road into a white ribbon between drifted banks. Louise's practice grew steadily as the town came to trust her. She saw 23 patients in her third week, including Cripple Pete again for his hand, which was healing beautifully, and Jenny Marsh for a check on the pregnancy, which was progressing well, and a 7-year-old boy named Charlie Ames who had fallen through the ice on the creek and needed warming treatment and monitoring for inflammation of the lungs. Charlie recovered fully within 4 days, and his mother, a quiet woman named Ruth Ames, brought Louise a knitted shawl in deep blue wool that Ruth had made herself and pressed it into her hands with wet eyes and could not speak. Eli came on his Thursdays and Saturdays. He always brought something more firewood as needed, topping up the pile that he kept well stocked, but also practical things. A better oil for the medical instruments to prevent rust in the cold, a bag of dried willow bark that he explained was useful as a pain remedy, a set of good quality iron hooks he had fashioned himself, and that she used to hang her drying herbs from the ceiling beams. They talked. They talked in the mornings over coffee, and they talked in the early evenings when he stayed late, and they talked sometimes in the middle of the day when she had a break between patients. She told him things about herself that she had not told anyone in a long time, about growing up in her aunt's house in a state of watchful self-sufficiency, about the years of study and the satisfaction of the work, about the loneliness that had lived alongside the work, and that she had mostly learned to ignore. He told her about the ridge and what it was like up there in the deep winter, when the snow piled so high against the cabin that he had to dig a tunnel to the woodshed, when the sky at night was so clear and cold that the stars looked sharp enough to cut, when the world contracted to just him and his small fire and the sound of wind over the peaks. He described it without sentimentality, just as a plain account of a life he had chosen and did not regret, and she listened and understood something essential about him, that he was a man who had peace with himself, genuine settled peace, and that it was one of the most attractive things she had ever encountered. One Thursday in early December, he arrived with the wood as usual, and then instead of coming inside, he stood at the door with his hat in his hands and asked if she would like to walk with him. Not far, just down to the edge of town and back along the creek. The snow had eased, and the afternoon light was pale gold on the white ground, and the air was cold and clean. She put on her coat and her good boots, and she walked with him. He matched his stride to hers without making it obvious, which was something a man of his size had to consciously do, and the fact that he did it told her something about him. They talked about the town. He knew things about its history that she did not, small stories about the founding families and the early years of the settlement, and they talked about the mountains, which she was still learning to love the way he loved them, and they walked to the edge of the creek and stood watching the ice that had formed along the banks while the dark water moved in the center. "Do you miss Denver?" he asked. "I miss certain things about it," she said honestly. "The library, a specific bakery, one or two people." She looked at the moving water. "But I do not miss it the way I would if I had left something behind that mattered most to me." He was quiet beside her for a moment. She could feel the warmth that radiated from his body despite the cold, because he was that much bigger than she was, and proximity to him was like standing near something that held heat the way stone did. "Louise," he said. She looked up at him. The pale December light was on his face, and his green eyes were very steady. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want to say it plainly because I do not know how to say things otherwise." "I prefer plain," she said. "I think about you a great deal," he said, "more than is probably casual. I come to town on Thursdays and Saturdays because those are the days I always came to town for supplies, but I come at this particular hour to this particular building because of you. I want you to know that I am aware of the difference between those two things." She looked at him for a long moment in the still cold air by the frozen-edged creek. "I am aware of the difference too," she said. Something in his expression shifted, not relief exactly, but a kind of quiet certainty settling into place. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. He offered her his arm for the walk back, and she took it, her hand in the crook of his elbow, her shoulder at approximately the level of his upper arm, and they walked back along the creek to the main road, and up the main road to the clinic, and neither of them said very much, but the silence had changed into a different kind of silence entirely, the kind that is full rather than empty. At her door he stopped and looked down at her, and she looked up at him, and the late afternoon light was going gold and pink in the west above the mountains. He reached out and tucked a loose strand of her dark hair back from her cheek with one careful, gentle touch of a finger so large and so careful that she felt the contrast of it like a physical note struck. "I will see you Saturday," he said. "Yes," she said. "You will." He walked back to his horse, and she stood in her doorway and watched him go, and felt the warmth inside the clinic reach for her from behind like a physical embrace. the warmth from the stove that had been burning faithfully all day from the wood he had stacked on her east wall, and she stepped inside and closed the door and stood in the middle of her small, warm, purposeful clinic, and felt something settle in her chest that had been restless for a very long time. December unfolded in layers. The romance between Louise and Eli developed with the same natural, unhurried pace as everything else he did, steadily, without drama, with a sureness that made the momentum feel inevitable rather than rushed. He came on Thursday and Saturday with the same regularity, but now there was no question about whether he came in or whether she put on coffee. Those things happened automatically, naturally, as if they had been established habits of years rather than weeks. He brought her things, and she had begun, carefully, to return the gesture, mending a tear in his coat sleeve with small, even stitches, while he sat across from her at the table and talked, or sending him home with a tin of the ginger biscuits she had learned to make in the small kitchen nook, because he had mentioned once, without emphasis, that he was not much of a baker. He had smiled at the biscuits in a way that was different from his usual near smile, warmer and more open, and she had felt the warmth of that expression all the rest of the day. He kissed her for the first time on a Saturday afternoon in the middle of December, standing in the doorway of the clinic while snow fell in soft, thick curtains outside. He had come in and they had talked for a while, and then he had stood to leave, and she had stood with him in the doorway as she usually did, and he had looked at her in that direct, serious way of his, and then he had bent his head, and she had lifted hers, and his mouth met hers in a kiss that was warm and careful and absolutely unhurried, the way he was in everything. And when he lifted his head and looked at her, she had both hands pressed flat against his chest and could feel the solid, immovable width of him under his coat. "I have been thinking about doing that since about the second week of October," he said, his voice low. "That is a reasonable amount of restraint," she said, slightly breathless. The corner of his mouth curved. "I'm a patient man." She laughed, a real laugh, clear and warm in the small doorway, and he watched her laugh with an expression that she had never seen on him before, open and luminous, as if the laugh had done something specific to his chest, and he was not trying to conceal what it was. She went up on her toes and kissed him again briefly and then stepped back. "Saturday," she said. "Saturday," he agreed, and went out into the snow. Christmas came to Colder Creek with a cold that dropped hard in the week before and settled over the town like a held breath. Louise's clinic was busy with the ailments that deep cold brought: frostbitten fingers, lung congestion, a nasty fever that went through several of the miners' families and kept her working late for 4 consecutive nights. She managed all of it with the focused steadiness that had become her signature, and Clara Holt helped when she was needed, and Thomas Holt brought over a roast from their ranch on Christmas Eve as a gift, and old Marcus appeared at her door on Christmas morning with a bottle of very decent whiskey, and the information that the entire town had taken a collection and wanted her to accept $12 for the winter's expenses, contributed by various people, including Bill Guthrie, who had sent $3 from his ranch as a particularly heartfelt contribution. Louise cried over the collection, which she had not expected, and she folded the money carefully into her leather purse and opened the clinic window and let the cold Christmas air in for a moment and breathed it. Eli came on Christmas afternoon. He brought her a gift wrapped in brown paper, a leather-bound journal, the kind used for medical records, with her name tooled into the front cover in small, careful letters. She ran her fingers over the letters and looked at him. He had not bought it, she realized. He had made the tooling himself, the letters precise and even, and the work was skilled and deliberate. "I cannot tool leather," she told him. "I know," he said. "That is why I did it." She had a gift for him, too. She had made it, because she had nothing to buy with a pair of knitted wool gloves in dark gray, thick and well made, sized for hands as large as his, and therefore requiring a rather different approach to the pattern than the standard, and she had worked on them for 3 weeks in the evenings after her last patient left. He pulled them on and looked at his hands in them, and she could see him feeling the quality of the knitting, the perfect fit, and something moved in his face that she recognized by now as the particular way he showed feeling when he felt it strongly, and was not quite ready to put it into words. "Louise," he said. "They will keep you warm on the ridge," she said. He looked at her over the top of the gloves and said very quietly, "I would like to bring you up to the ridge sometime, if you are willing. I want to show you what it looks like from up there in the winter." She held his gaze. "I would like that very much." He stayed for dinner that evening. She had made a proper stew, not the improvised quick meals she usually subsisted on, and she lit the 2 good candles she had been saving, and they sat across from each other at the small table in the warm clinic kitchen and ate and talked, and the snow fell softly outside the window. After dinner, he helped her clear the table without being asked, moving around the small space with a care for not being too large in it that she found endearing in a man who could have moved through it like a bull through a fence. He left at 9, when the cold outside had reached the deep serious cold of a mountain Christmas night, and he held her hands in his at the door and looked at her as if she were something he was trying to memorize, and she looked back at him with the same intention, and it was a good, warm, full kind of looking. "Happy Christmas, Louise Walker," he said. "Happy Christmas, Eli Bass," she said. He kissed her good night and walked out into the cold night, and she watched the lantern on his wagon move away up the road and into the dark until she could not see it any more. And then she closed the door and cleaned up and went to bed and slept better than she had slept since arriving in Colder Creek. January came in hard. The ridge road to Eli's cabin became, for 3 weeks, impassable even for a horse and experienced rider, and he was cut off from town by a series of storms that stacked themselves one after another over the mountains without pause. Louise stood at her clinic window on the worst of those nights, listening to the wind drive snow against the glass, and thought about him up there in that cabin with the fire going high and the snow piled to the eaves, and felt a specific, particular kind of worry that she recognized as the worry of a woman who has a stake in the well-being of a specific man. She kept busy. January was her busiest month so far. The cold brought everything that winter did to a human body, all the ways it found the cracks. She was in the clinic before sunrise and often past midnight. She began keeping better records, using the beautiful leather journal Eli had made her, writing up every case with the thoroughness she had been taught, building the history of the town's health in careful ink. She began making plans for a small surgery room, partitioned off from the main clinic space, where she could do more involved procedures with better privacy. She wrote letters to the medical supply house in Denver and to a colleague of Dr. Prentice who practiced in Pueblo and might be able to advise on certain cases. She wrote a letter to Eli, which she could not send because the post road was as closed as everything else, but she wrote it anyway and kept it in her journal. It was not a dramatic letter. It described what she was doing and what she was thinking, and what the town looked like under 3 feet of snow, and how the clinic smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs, and how she had been using his firewood with a particular gratitude every single day, and how she missed the Thursdays and Saturdays with a sharp, specific longing she found she did not want to fight. She did not reread the letter. She wrote it and put it away, and that was enough. On the 22nd of January, the storms broke. The sky cleared overnight into a hard, brilliant blue cold that made everything look cut from glass, and by mid-morning the road up the ridge was usable. She was between patients when she heard the sound of a wagon on the road, and she did not let herself run to the window, only walked to it. And it was him, of course it was him, the big draft horse making slow progress through the deep snow, and Eli up on the seat with his new gray gloves on his hands and his breath steaming in the cold air. She had the door open before he tied the horse. He climbed down and came up the steps, and she was standing in the doorway, and he stopped 2 feet from her and looked at her, and she looked at him, both of them just looking for a moment. "I could not come," he said. "I know," she said. "I know you would have if you could." 3 weeks is too long, he said. Yes, she agreed, it was. He came in and she closed the door and he put down the things he had brought: more wood, a package of dried venison, a small wax-sealed jar of preserved summer berries that she somehow understood had come from his own stores, set aside for this specific purpose. And then he straightened up and looked at her, and without any particular ceremony she walked to him and put her arms around him, or as far around him as they would reach, her face against his chest. And he wrapped both arms around her with that careful, encompassing power of his and held her. They stood like that for a long moment. His heartbeat was steady under her ear. The fire crackled. Outside, the brilliant cold January light lay over everything. I wrote you a letter I could not send, she said against his coat. She felt his arms tighten fractionally. I would like to read it sometime, he said. Maybe, she said. We will see. She tipped her head back to look at him and he looked down at her, and there was nothing uncertain about the way he kissed her this time. Nothing held back or careful, just the full warmth of it, of 3 weeks apart, and the fact that this was real and present and entirely itself. And she kissed him back the same way, and it was very good indeed. He stayed the whole afternoon. They talked and there was coffee, and he fixed the hinge on her storage cupboard that had been sticking since October, and she showed him the surgery partition she had planned, and talked him through her reasoning, and he listened with genuine interest and asked smart, practical questions, and then suggested that the partition wall would be more stable if he used a different joint in the framing. And she said she had not considered that, and he said he could build it in a day when the weather held. She let him build it, and he built it in a day in early February when a warm break came through and the snow softened, and he was steady and precise and efficient with the timber in the way she had come to expect from him. And by the end of the day she had a proper partition wall with a good door on it, and she stood in the new surgery space and felt the satisfaction of a thing well done, and turned to tell him so, and found him already looking at her with that specific warmth in his eyes. February was the hardest month of the winter, and also, in ways she could not have predicted, the best. The hard part was the weather and the strain it put on the town. 2 children sick with scarlet fever at the same time, both in the same family, a situation that kept Louise at their bedside for 6 days in a state of controlled vigilance, while their parents stood at the edges of the room with that devastating parental terror she had learned to witness without letting it shatter her own steadiness. Both children survived. Their mother wept against Louise's shoulder in the kitchen afterward in a way that said everything that needed to be said. The good part was Eli. He was around more in February, coming down from the ridge whenever the weather allowed, helping practically in ways that did not require asking, maintaining the clinic's firewood supply, fixing a leak in the roof before it became a serious problem, helping old Marcus dig out the main road after a particularly savage storm because the town needed it clear, and he was the man with the broadest back and the most willingness to use it. He became, by degrees, simply a presence in Colder Creek in a way he had not been before, less the solitary mountain man of the ridge and more a man who had something drawing him to the valley. Everyone in the town knew what was happening, and no one said anything directly because they had the Western courtesy not to. But there were looks, and there was Marcus's barely suppressed satisfaction, and Clara Holt's quiet smile. And when Eli and Louise walked together to the church social in mid-February, she was aware of the town's collective warmth toward the fact of them, and it felt good in the way that being known and accepted by a community always does. At the social, they danced. Eli was not a natural dancer, but he was a strong one, and she led him slightly through the calls, and he followed with the good humor of a man who does not embarrass easily. And she laughed at the serious concentration on his face when the steps got complicated, and he looked down at her laughing and shook his head, and smiled the real full smile that she had been gathering like something precious each time it appeared. "You are finding this very funny," he observed. "You look like a man attempting a mathematical proof," she said. "Dancing was not a skill my father considered essential to survival in the mountains," he he said with dignity. No, she agreed, still laughing. I suppose not. He swung her out and back in a move that was technically incorrect but entirely confident, and she yelped and laughed harder, and he caught her and looked at her, laughing in her face. And for a moment the whole room receded and it was just him looking at her that way, with everything he felt right there in his expression without a wall in front of it. And she stopped laughing and looked back at him with the same openness, and the music played on around them. March arrived, and with it the first suggestions of the season turning. The snow was still deep, but the quality of the light had changed, coming at a different angle, and there were afternoons when something in the air hinted at green things waiting beneath the white. It was in early March that Eli asked her to come up to the ridge. The road was good enough, he said, and he would bring the wagon down and collect her on a Sunday when the clinic was usually quiet, and he would have her back by dark, and he wanted her to see his place and understand what it was and what he was in it. She understood, without him saying so, that this was a significant invitation. This was him saying, here is the essential thing about me, the most central thing, and I want you to see it and know whether it fits with what you are. She went. The road up the ridge was narrow and steep in places, but Eli drove it with the familiarity of a man who had made the trip 1,000 times, the big horse steady on the packed snow, and Louise sat beside him on the wagon seat and watched the valley open up below them as they climbed, and felt the particular vertiginous beauty of mountain perspective. His cabin was larger than she had imagined and more carefully made, the logs fitted with precision, the chinking clean and tight, a wide covered porch that in summer would overlook a view of the valley that stretched for miles. Inside it was warm and orderly in the manner of a man who lives alone and has organized his space according to deep personal logic. The tools hung exactly so, the kitchen provisions stocked and arranged, the books, and there were books, more than she had expected, a full shelf of them, standing neat against the wall. A large bearskin rug covered most of the main floor. The fireplace was massive, built from the ridge stone, and it burned a fire that could have heated a building twice the cabin's size. On the north wall was a single large window, and through it she could see exactly what he had described in December. The entire valley spread below, the town of Colder Creek reduced to a small collection of rooftops, and the mountains beyond in their winter white, enormous and immediate and indifferent in the way that genuinely enormous things always are. She stood at the window for a long time. You can see my chimney, she said. Yes, he said from behind her. I can. She turned from the window and looked at him standing in the middle of his cabin in the place that was most fundamentally his, and she saw him in that context, this big, self-sufficient, quiet man who had spent 8 years making a life in this exact spot and who had come down out of it for her, again and again, because he had seen her chimney cold in October and chosen to do something about it. Eli, she said. He was watching her carefully, the way he always did when something mattered. I think I love you, she said. She said it plainly, because she had learned that plain was what he understood best and what she meant most honestly. I think I have been working up to knowing that for a while now, and I know it clearly today. He crossed the room to her in 4 steps and took her face in both hands, his enormous careful hands, and looked at her up close the way he had been wanting to, the way she could see he had been wanting to, and said, I know that I love you. I have known it for some time. How long? Since November, he said. Since the night you operated on Guthrie, and you went completely still at the moment when everything was worst and saved his life, and then sat down in that chair, and let someone put a blanket over you, and that was all. That was when I knew. She pressed her hands over his. That is a very specific moment to pinpoint. I am a specific man. She kissed him there at his window, with the mountains behind her and the valley below, and he held her in the warm fire-lit cabin, and it was entirely complete, the moment, lacking nothing. They talked all afternoon. They talked about things they had not yet said about what the future might look like, about the clinic and the ridge and what it might mean to have both those things in a life that contained 2 people rather than one. He was not a man who rushed these things, and neither was she. But they were also not young, and they both knew their own minds, and there was no real uncertainty about the direction they were moving in, only the practical question of how. He brought her back to town as the light was failing and the temperature dropping toward the serious cold of a March evening, and he walked her to the clinic door and held both her hands, and she looked up at him in the blue dusk and felt the full weight of what had shifted today. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Not today because I want to do it properly, but I want you to know I am planning to." She understood him exactly. "I want you to," she said. He squeezed her hands and let them go, and the smile he gave her as he walked back to the wagon was the fullest, warmest thing she had seen on him yet. And she watched him all the way up the road until the dark took him, and then she went inside to her warm clinic, and she stood with her back against the closed door and just breathed, and the fire burned on the stove from the last of the wood she had added that morning. April was green and extraordinary. The snow retreated up the mountains and the valley floor came back to life in stages, pale grass first, then the willows along the creek going soft and gold green, then the first wildflowers in the meadows above the town, small and brave and numerous. Louise began to understand, for the first time, what Colder Creek looked like when it was not winter, and it was startlingly beautiful, the mountains showing their true colors and the sky a deep, clean blue that seemed to go higher here than it had anywhere else she had lived. Her clinic was thriving. She had 47 patients now on a regular basis, not counting the acute and emergency cases, and her reputation had spread to the ranches and small settlements within a 15-mile radius. She had delivered 2 babies, Jenny Marshes, a healthy boy whom Jenny and Ward named Thomas after Thomas Holt, and who arrived with minimal drama in the second week of March, and another to a homesteader woman named Bet Parsons who had ridden in from 8 miles away in the early stages of labor, and who said she had heard that the woman doctor in Colder Creek was the one to go to. "Woman doctor," Louise had repeated as she helped Bet through the door. "Is that wrong?" Bet had said, slightly breathless. "No," Louise said, "not at all. It is just nice to hear it said as a fact rather than an argument." The baby was a girl and Bet named her Louise, which made the healer in question have to step outside the clinic door for a moment to collect herself. On the 14th of April, Eli came down from the ridge on a clear afternoon, and he was carrying a bunch of wildflowers he had clearly picked on the way down, the kind of thing a man like him would do awkwardly and without ceremony, and he handed them to her with the expression of a man who is aware he looks slightly foolish and does not mind. She laughed and took them and put them in water, and when she turned back around he was on one knee on the clinic floor, which was simultaneously so unexpected and so exactly right that she felt her breath catch entirely. He was holding a ring. It was plain and beautiful silver, with a small oval of dark blue stone that she would later learn he had gotten from a Ute craftsman he had traded with for years, the stone from the mountains themselves, the silver work done by the jeweler in Garvey to Eli's specification. "Louise Walker," he said, in the direct, steady voice that she had come to love as one of the essential sounds of her world, "I would like to marry you, if you will have me. I know that I live on a ridge and you have a clinic in a valley, and that there are things we will need to work out about what that looks like, and I am ready to work all of it out. I know you are more capable of managing your life than anyone I have ever known, and that you do not need anyone to manage it for you. I am not asking because I think you need me. I am asking because I want to be the man who is there, through all of it, and I want you to be the person who is there for me. That is all I want. I just want it for the rest of my life." She stood very still. Then she said, "Yes," and her voice was entirely steady and entirely certain. "Yes, Eli, that is exactly what I want too." He put the ring on her finger and stood up, and he was so much bigger than her that, when he pulled her close, she had to stretch up and he had to come down, and it was always going to be a little awkward geometrically, and neither of them minded at all. They were married in June, in the little church in Colder Creek, on a Saturday afternoon when the light came through the high windows in long gold bars, and the wildflowers Louise had gathered that morning sat in jars on every windowsill. Clara Holt stood up with Louise, and old Marcus, who was 63 years old and deeply emotional about the whole thing, stood up with Eli. The Reverend was a young man named Parks who had been in Colder Creek only since the previous fall, and was therefore slightly surprised to be officiating what felt like a very settled and long-established event. The whole town came. There were perhaps 70 people in the small church, which held perhaps 50, and the overflow stood in the doorway and outside the windows, and someone propped the side door open, and the warm June air came in and mixed with the wood-polish smell of the church and the wildflowers. Bill Guthrie sat in the third pew and periodically had to press his large hand against his face, and his hands looked perfectly fine because Louise had stitched them well, and this small detail made her very happy. Jenny Marsh was there with baby Thomas, who was 3 months old and entirely unaware of the significance of the occasion, but who was carried by Jenny in a very ceremonial fashion. Little Charlie Ames, who had fully recovered from his icy plunge months ago, sat in the second row with his mother Ruth, and watched the proceedings with the intense, serious interest of a 7-year-old boy who has been told this is important. Eli stood at the front of the church in a good dark coat that fitted across his enormous shoulders with the ease of something made specifically for him, which Clara Holt's seamstress aunt in Garvey had indeed done, and he watched Louise walk up the aisle with the expression she had seen on him at the church social in February, the full unguarded one, the one that held nothing back, and she walked toward it feeling entirely herself, exactly herself, in her simple white dress and the wildflowers in her dark hair. And she thought that this was one of the very few moments in her life when everything was precisely as it should be. They said their vows plainly and clearly in the manner of two people who meant every word and did not see any reason to dress it up. When Reverend Parks pronounced them married and Eli kissed her, the church erupted in a warmth of sound that was part applause and part general vocal pleasure, and old Marcus may or may not have made a noise that could only be described as a sob of joy, which he would deny firmly for the rest of his life. The reception was held in the wide field behind the church, which the town had set up with long tables brought from the saloon and the schoolhouse, and laden with everything people had contributed: roasted meats and bread and preserves, and 3 different kinds of pie, and the bottle of good whiskey that old Marcus had been saving since God only knew when. And someone had brought out a fiddle and a banjo, and by 6 o'clock in the evening the dancing had spilled out past the tables and into the meadow grass, and Louise danced with her husband, and he had unquestionably improved since the church social. "You practiced," she said, looking up at him in the warm June evening. "I had Marcus teach me 2 steps," he said with enormous dignity. "Just 2. "Which 2? "The reel and the waltz." The waltz seemed important. She laughed, and he drew her closer, and they waltzed in the meadow grass while the fiddle played and the mountains stood golden in the evening light, and the whole world felt wide and warm and entirely good. The practical working out of the 2 lives that he had promised to navigate turned out to be straightforward in the end, as most things are when the people involved genuinely want to find the solution. Louise kept her clinic and her practice, because Colder Creek still needed her and she still needed her work. It was too central to who she was to give up, and Eli would never have asked her to. Eli kept his cabin on the ridge because it was his and because it made sense for his trapping and timber work, but they built something else. In the late summer, Eli took the timber from the west stand of his ridge property and built an extension onto the clinic, a proper living space, with a real kitchen and a sitting room and a good sleeping room, twice the size of the previous dwelling space. He built it in 2 months with the help of Thomas Holt and Ward Marsh, and a young man named Callum who was learning carpentry from Ward, and who looked at Eli's technique with something approaching reverence. Louise's clinic and their new home shared a wall, which meant she was always immediately available for emergencies, and never more than 30 seconds from her medical instruments. They arranged the living room with her books and his, which covered the shelves in 2 languages because it turned out Eli had learned some French from a trapper partner years ago and had several volumes in it. The kitchen had real pans and a proper iron range and a window over the work table that faced east and caught the morning light. The cabin on the ridge remained theirs. They went up on Sundays when the weather allowed, taking the road that Louise had now traveled enough times to know well, and they spent those days in a companionable way that was different from the week, quieter and more inward, the two of them and the mountains and the view of the valley below. She had come to love the ridge in all its seasons. She loved the way spring arrived later up there, cautious and tentative. She loved the summer wildflowers on the high meadow above the cabin. She loved the view in winter, which was the most extraordinary thing she had ever seen in her life, the whole world white and still below, and the sky above so deep it seemed to have no ceiling. The autumn of 1879 came in gold and red and smelled of wood smoke and the particular dry sweetness of fallen leaves. Louise kept her records in the leather journal Eli had made her, which she had nearly filled, and she had written to the medical supply house for a second one. The clinic's income was steady enough now that she had no money worries, and she had 2 regular patients who paid in trade rather than coin, the farm wife who brought eggs and the woodcutter whose family brought venison, and she counted these as abundantly adequate. On an October morning exactly 1 year from the day Eli had first knocked on her clinic door, she told him over breakfast that she was pregnant. He was in the middle of pouring coffee, and he set the pot down very carefully on the range and turned to look at her. She watched him process the information, watched the movement go through his face, the surprise and then the depth beneath the surprise, the quality of the feeling that was too large for his expression to fully contain. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and pulled her into his arms and held her, not with the careful, measured gentleness he sometimes used, aware of the difference in their sizes, but with the full strength of him, and she felt herself entirely enclosed and held and present. "Are you all right?" he asked against her hair. "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am a healer, you know. I will monitor the situation quite thoroughly." She felt the small vibration in his chest that meant he was laughing. "I know you will," he said. "I just needed to ask." "I know," she said. "I love that you asked." He made the coffee and she made toast on the range, and they sat at the kitchen table in the October morning light and talked about what it would mean and how they would manage. And it was the same conversation they had had about every practical challenge so far, which was to say it was collaborative and specific and arrived at solutions without drama, because that was how they worked. The pregnancy progressed through the winter with the steadiness Louise had promised. She continued working in the clinic through most of it, modifying her work as needed and trusting her own knowledge of her body. And Clara Holt visited weekly and was relentlessly supportive and occasionally bossy in exactly the right measure. Eli stacked the firewood that winter with a particular thoroughness that she teased him about, and he accepted the teasing with the equanimity of a man who does not see thoroughness as something to be defensive about. The baby came in late June 1880, on a warm summer night when the windows were open and the sound of crickets came in from the meadow. It was a boy. Louise had suspected so from various signs she had noted with her professional eye. And she was right, and she was glad to be right, not because she had a preference for boys over girls, but because she liked being correct in her assessments. Eli was present for the birth, which was not standard practice for a husband in 1880, but Louise was the healer, and she made her own rules about her own clinic and her own delivery, and Clara Holt assisted, and Eli was steady throughout in exactly the way she had known he would be. When she placed the baby in his arms, their son, red-faced and furious about being new and screaming the fact to all available ears, and watched Eli hold him for the first time, she saw something on his face that she had never seen before and that she knew she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Pure, open, undiluted wonder. He held the baby with the same impossible gentleness with which he touched everything that mattered to him, those enormous hands cradling something so small, and he looked down at the boy with the expression of a man encountering something he had not known he was waiting for until it arrived. "Hello," he said quietly to the baby in his deep, unhurried voice. "Hello." The baby's screaming subsided just slightly, as if the sound of that voice carried something recognizable. They named him James after no one in particular, just because it suited him. James Bass, solid and strong, who grew into a boy with his father's green eyes and his mother's direct way of looking at things. 2 years later, a daughter came. They named her Rose, because it was June again, and the roses that Louise had planted along the east wall of the clinic were in full bloom when she arrived, and because the name was quiet and strong in the way Louise liked names to be. James was 2 years old when Rose was born and treated his new sister with the solemn importance of a small person who has been told this is a serious responsibility. And Eli watched James hold Rose for the first time with the same look on his face that Louise had seen when he first held James. And she sat in her bed in the clinic, turned home, and looked at her family and felt the full, rounded, complete weight of everything that had come to be from a woman arriving in a cold town with $12 and a stove that could not be lit. The years that followed Colder Creek grew around the clinic and the Bass family, the way a tree grows around something it incorporates into its structure. The town expanded. A schoolteacher arrived in 1881, and a second general store opened, and a telegraph line came through in 1882, which connected Colder Creek to the wider world in a way that changed the tone of the place subtly, making it feel less like the edge of things and more like a part of things. Louise welcomed most of this and noted the changes with the interest of a woman who had always paid attention. Her practice grew in scope. She trained a young woman named Pearl, the daughter of a homesteader family from the valley's eastern edge, who came to her at 17, having read everything she could find about medicine and wanting to learn more. And Louise took her on as an apprentice with the full intention of teaching her everything she knew, because Louise understood from her own experience what it meant to have someone take a woman seriously in medicine, and she was not going to withhold that from Pearl if Pearl had the aptitude, which she clearly did. Pearl lived in the clinic's back room for 2 years and was one of the most capable students Louise had ever worked with. And when Pearl eventually went to Denver to formalize her training under a doctor Louise had known through Prentice, Louise watched her go with an enormous and entirely satisfied pride. Eli kept the ridge and the cabin and the timber stand and the trapping lines. He came down every day now rather than twice a week, because that was where his life was, but he kept the ridge because it was his, and because there was something about him that always needed the high country. He and James began going up together on Saturday mornings from the time James was old enough to ride safely, and Louise would watch them go up the road, the big man and the small boy, and feel a contentment so deep it had no words she knew for it. The town took care of its healer and its mountain man in return for what they gave it. When the clinic needed repairs after a particularly rough winter in 1883, 10 men showed up on a Saturday morning without being asked, because old Marcus had mentioned it in passing at the general store 3 days before, and these things moved through Colder Creek at the speed of simple human decency. When Eli's north pasture fence was destroyed by a downed tree in a storm, the same pattern repeated itself. The town had taken them in and they had taken the town in, and the exchange was circular and sustaining. In the winter of 1884, on a cold, clear December evening that smelled of wood smoke and pine needles and the particular clean cold of Colorado mountain air, Louise stood at the back door of her clinic and looked at the east wall. 6 years of firewood, stacked every year by Eli with thoroughness and care, the pile always full before the first October snow. She had stopped trying to track the debt or the accounting of it long ago, which was the moment she had fully understood what he had meant that second morning when he said consider it a community service. It had never been about the wood. She heard the front door and James's voice, high and clear, telling his father something with the excited urgency of a 7-year-old who has discovered something important about beetles, which was his current fascination. She heard Eli's lower voice responding with genuine attentiveness, asking a specific question, because he had never treated the things his children cared about as small. She heard Rose's younger voice joining in from the kitchen where she had been allegedly helping Clara Holt's daughter with a baking project that was clearly going wrong based on the thump of something dense hitting the floor. Louise came in from the back door, hung up her coat, pushed her dark hair back from her face with both hands, and stood in the doorway of the sitting room watching her family inhabit the warm space. James was laying out beetle findings on the study table with his father bent over beside him, enormous and focused and genuinely interested. Rose had retrieved whatever had fallen and was explaining something with her characteristic Louise-like gravity to the Clara's daughter. The fire burned high and warm in the stove, the woodbox beside it full to the top. Eli looked up across the room and found her in the doorway, the way he always looked up when she came into a room, as if some internal register told him the moment she crossed a threshold, and he looked at her with the same directness and warmth and steady specific love that he had been looking at her with for 6 years, and she looked back the same way. And James said, "Papa, look at this one, it has 12 spots." And Eli looked back down and said, 12. That is remarkable, let us count them. And Louise smiled and went to put the kettle on. The mountains were white above the town in the December evening. The clinic was warm and full of life. The firewood was stacked to last the winter. And the two people who had found each other because a chimney ran cold in October, and a man on a ridge could see further than most, were both, entirely and without reservation, home. James and Rose grew up in Colder Creek with the particular combination of their parents. James with his father's patient strength, and his mother's diagnostic precision, Rose with her mother's directness and her father's deep, unhurried attentiveness to the living world. James would eventually ride the trapping lines with Eli and then go east to study civil engineering, and he would come back, because Colder Creek was in him the way the mountains were in Eli. Rose would take her mother's medical interests further than Louise had been able to go in her time, training at a proper school in the East when such things became possible, and the leather-bound journal that Eli had made Louise would eventually sit in Rose's clinic as the first volume of a medical record of Colder Creek that spanned 4 decades. But those years were still ahead on that December evening in 1884. What existed on that evening was the fire and the wood smoke and the mountains and the family, and the small, extraordinary, ordinary miracle of a life built from practical love and the willingness to knock on a stranger's door because a chimney was cold and that seemed wrong, and to open that door and let someone in, and to build from there, log by careful log, everything good. Louise stood at the window of the clinic that had become their home with a cup of tea warming her hands and looked out at the main street of Colder Creek in the winter dark, the lamp light from the windows making orange patches on the snow, the mountains invisible above the town but present the way permanent things always are, and she was deeply, completely, irreversibly content. Eli came to stand behind her, setting his large hands on her shoulders, and looked out the window with her. "Snowing again," he said. "Yes," she said, heavily. "Wood is stacked." "It always is," she said. He pressed his mouth against the top of her hair, and she leaned back against the solid strength of him, and outside the snow came down in the quiet mountain dark, the same snow that had fallen on her first October in Colder Creek, the same cold that had stood at the window before she knew what warmth was waiting, and the fire burned on in the stove, and the woodbox was full, and the clinic was warm, and it was, in every way that mattered, everything.